Hi, welcome to the Introduction to Financial Aid webinar from Matriculate. My name is Murab Sarwar. I work as a program associate for 3 campuses, Emory, Columbia, and the University of Notre Dame, and I am joined by...
Hi, this is Lakeisha Gonzalez, and I'm the program associate and campus lead for Yale and our new partnerships with the University of Wisconsin and the University of Pennsylvania. So to go over today's agenda, we're going to give some context and an overview of the financial aid process, different types of aid, and how you'll be supporting your students in completing the process. We're going to go over the timeline for applying for aid, as well as address the main components of financial aid, and then finish off with some additional resources, as well as a checklist and next steps.
So really, as we talk about the financial aid process and for your role as an advising fellow, our end goals are really to make sure that you feel comfortable and feel prepared to support your high school fellows in navigating this process, learning the main components of financial aid and how and when students access them, understanding financial aid submission timelines and the importance of upcoming milestones in your student's progress, and lastly, specifically, your role as an advising fellow in being able to answer student questions and navigating specific situations. I think it's difficult when you are only using your own experience to assess financial aid, and as you start working with your students, you will run into a lot of weird or out-of-the-box situations, and understanding that this process is kind of like a puzzle, and that different sources of funding and different sources of aid end up all being some parts of the puzzle, but in reality, kind of being able to then put this together to reach a good financial outcome is really what we're shooting for here. So really, this is going to be an overview of all the processes, but being able to use all of your resources here to make sure that you're putting your high school fellow in the best position is important here, and we're here as a resource to get you through it.
So with financial aid, there are a variety of sources that make up a student's comprehensive financial aid package. Starting with federal aid, that's made up of grants, loans, and work study funds, and that's going to be addressed in the next slide. But we also have state aid, and individual states may offer tuition assistance programs for public and private colleges for residents of that state. And then institutional aid, which is merit or need-based and determined by an individual college or university. So that will vary by school.
So what type of aid is offered at these institutions or offered by those sources of funding? And that's broken down to really 3 sources of income or 3 sources of installments. So one is loans. As you should know, loans are funds that are borrowed and have to be repaid. These can come from everywhere, so federal, state, and private. There are grants, which do not need to be repaid, so those are free. And this also includes scholarships. This can also come from all 3 sources, federal, state, college, and private. And then lastly, work study, which requires students to earn money through worked hours. And this will vary by institution, whether that's working specifically at your school, whether that school has a specific program that students can do to then work hours to maintain funding. Those are all really important things to clarify as your students start exploring different schools and different options, but are available out there to supplement additional income. In the coming months, you'll be supporting your students in a variety of means and by basically helping them complete the following documents. There is the FAFSA, which is a free application for federal student aid, the CSS Profile, which is ran by the College Board, another college scholarship service. There will be supplemental state assistance forms, which vary by state, and then lastly, supplemental institutional forms, which will vary, as you guessed it, vary by institution.
So when thinking about the FAFSA, you should consider this to be the foundational resource for your student being eligible for aid. Once a student applies for the FAFSA, they're then eligible for federal and state student grants, work study, and loans. And we're encouraging, regardless of income, for all high school fellows to complete the FAFSA. It's also important to note that the FAFSA needs to be completed every year. So the FAFSA opens on October 1st, and the priority deadline is November 15th. Regardless of how long the application is open, we're encouraging students to apply as early as possible because earlier completion gives them access to first come, first served funding sources, but different colleges and states will have earlier deadlines depending on when the application is due. For instance, you'll see that Princeton needs to have the FAFSA submitted by November 1st. And it's just important to know that what the product of the FAFSA allows you to think more closely about whether a school is a better financial fit for you. So the earlier that you fill out this form, the better it is for you to start applying the information that you receive from it to the schools on your college list and making the best financial decision from there.
So next we'll talk about really kind of at the FAFSA. First and foremost, your students will be registering themselves for an account, which ends up in an FSA ID. With that, they fill out the FAFSA through assembling necessary financial information. This can include W-2s, 1080 tax returns, and like to really discuss family income and go from there. They'll click the submit button. It'll be a great moment. And then what that happens and what that produces is the student aid report. This document really we'll go into more detail about this, but this includes the estimated family contribution, the EFC, and will be used to assess their level of financial aid for not just the federal government, but from all levels of sources. And they use their FSA ID to sign their FAFSA, so that is basically used as a signature. So in addition to the student creating an FSA ID, a student's parent will also be creating their own FSA ID account to then verify and sign the FAFSA information at the end of this as well. To be eligible to fill out the FAFSA, students need to be U.S. citizens or U.S. permanent residents. There are also other categories of non-residents. If you believe your student applies to one of these categories, make sure that you're doing the research here and encouraging your students to understand like where they fall into this. If you need help or assistance to kind of understanding what makes a student a refugee or a student asylum grantee, really make sure to flag that to your head advising fellow or to your campus lead so that you can kind of receive more assistance to getting the resources that you need to help support your student. What is required by filling out the FAFSA is a lot of personal information. Every student, and for your student and their parents, this means social security numbers, dates of birth, their parents' tax returns or W-2s, their students' tax returns or W-2s, especially if they work, any records of non-taxable income, bank statements, farm statements if applicable, and then any documentation of extraordinary circumstances that can flag something not conventional that schools might see. And school codes for that correlate to the schools that your students are thinking about applying to. One thing to note as well with DACA students that are DACA but also have a social security number should still submit a FAFSA. They won't be eligible for federal aid, but the student aid report that comes out at the end still helps colleges decide what level of institutional aid that they can give the student. Again, there is a lot to thinking about how to incorporate the FAFSA and whether or not your student is eligible or not. If you have any questions or need additional help on figuring this stuff out, flag it to someone and we can get you there.
If there are questions about what exactly the student aid report is, it's a paper or electronic document which lists the answers to the questions on the FAFSA that were completed by your HSF. The form itself this is the one that you should be referencing with your student. You should never necessarily have access to their personal tax documents, but this will give you all of the information that you need to adequately support them through this process. HSFs should carefully review this to make sure that all of the information was submitted accurately, because this is the document that also produces your estimated family contribution. If your high school fellow is applying to more than 10 schools, there is a way to complete that through the FAFSA. You would just have to put the first 10 schools on the first round of submission, and once submitted, you are able to go back into the FAFSA and make corrections, and that's when the student will be able to add the additional school codes and resubmit for corrections. This doesn't take away from the initial 10 schools that they applied for. It's just making sure that they apply to however many in addition to those first 10.
So by filling out the FAFSA, students then become eligible for a variety of federal funds. And with that, the first and foremost, or the most popular one that students will have heard about, or that you probably have heard about, is the federal Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is awarded based on estimated family contributions, so solely on financial need, and this can go up to close to $6,195 a year. So if you have a student that gets an EFC of 0, they would be eligible for this maximum amount for the Pell Grant. In addition to that, there's also the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or the SEOG, and this can be up to $4,000 a year. This will be awarded to students with the greatest amount of financial need and will be given at the school's discretion. So those are the grants. That is money that doesn't have to be repaid, that is awarded to a student and doesn't have to be thought about twice. For federal loans, that is a little bit different. This could be awarded to a student based off their FAFSA, but comes in different ways. So for the Stafford loans, this can come either, so they could be awarded a Stafford loan or not be awarded a Stafford loan. If they are awarded a Stafford loan, these loans could either be subsidized or unsubsidized. And subsidized loans what that means is that these do not accrue interest while a student is in school. So if a student borrows money, they would then just repay the same amount of money right after they graduate, or then start paying their loans with interest after they graduate. If a student receives an unsubsidized Stafford loan, this means that it is accruing interest the minute they accept the loan. So obviously, when thinking about those two loans, a subsidized loan is better than an unsubsidized loan, but it's very important to pay attention to this, especially as we get to February and later on in the spring, as you are preparing to work with your students when they are receiving award letters and being able to talk about the differences in Stafford loans. Lastly, there's also the parent loan for undergraduate students, which is also referred to as a Parent Plus loan. This is, again, when students still have a really high financial need remaining even after all the financial aid that is awarded to them. And this will allow parents to borrow the total cost of college minus any financial aid received. So again, it's important here to really distinguish the difference in loan amounts and what is reasonable for a student to take versus what is unreasonable. And again, talking to your students about the investment in education versus potentially overwhelming debt. For those of you who are working with College Board students, and really for all students in general who should have applied to the College Board Opportunity Scholarship by now, we spoke a little bit about this in the August webinar, but as a quick refresher, the College Board Opportunity Scholarship is a scholarship through the College Board that awards students, regardless of financial need, if they complete certain tasks within the college application process. With our webinar today, we're really tackling the FAFSA, and in recognition to the College Board Opportunity Scholarship, by completing the FAFSA and recording it on the CBOS, what this does is that it makes students eligible to receive the $1,000 amount by completing the FAFSA, and is of course important if you are having a student that's trying to complete all 6 CBOS tasks. So again, every single student should be applying for the FAFSA, And this means that if they are doing so, that they are automatically eligible for this at least $1,000 reward from the College Board. So making sure that your students understand this is key, and to not miss out on an opportunity that seems very easily available.
Moving on to the CSS profile, this is another application, an online application administered by the College Board, which collects information used by nearly 400 colleges and scholarships to award non-federal aid. It's important to note that the 400 colleges are not just private institutions; they also include public, highly selective schools. So this is something that all students might be filling out. The milestone for this is for December 15th or by the individual school priority deadlines. So it's important to pay attention to when those deadlines are and look on the financial aid page of each school's site.
Some more details about the CSS profile. It will open October 1st as well. Our deadline is, or the deadline to fill this out is usually 2 weeks before. The deadline to fill the CSS profile out is 2 weeks before usually the school's priority deadline. So as Lakeisha just mentioned, really make sure to be proactive and understand the deadlines for each school so that your student is finishing the CSS profile before a priority deadline. Opposed to the FAFSA, the CSS profile is not a free application. There is a fee of $25 to apply, and then $16 per school report after. There are waivers available, so if your student received an SAT waiver, they are eligible to receive fee waivers for the CSS, or if they have a family income below $45,000, they are still automatically eligible to receive a fee waiver for the CSS profile. Again, it's required by many private colleges and is included by a ton of selective schools. There is a different financial picture that comes out through the CSS profile that will be different than the FAFSA, and it is used to award institutional aid. The schools that offer high amounts of financial aid or just high institutional aid in general will most likely also require that students fill out the CSS profile. And this is because the CSS profile has a lot more detailed information to fill out. So this can, instead of just a 1080 form, your students may need to talk about forms if their family owns a house, or if they own a car, or if their family has any stock options. These are all things that don't get necessarily reported on the FAFSA, but are critical to still understanding a financial picture from the school's perspective. Unlike the FAFSA, so once you submit the CSS profile, you're not able to return to the form to make changes. Having your students be very careful before submitting this is incredibly key, as being meticulously correct here so that they are not flagged for verification will be important. It's also a much more detailed and longer application to fill out. Giving your students an hour to 2 hours is usually recommended here, and that's including having all the financial information right in front of them so that they can fill this out to the best of their ability. Additionally, outside of the CSS profile, there's also the EyeDoc. So once the FAFSA and CSS profile are submitted, there is a chance that colleges will still require further documentation through the Institutional Documentation Service, also known as EyeDoc. The College Board collects federal tax returns and other documents on behalf of participating colleges and programs. Again, these documents are required, and the way that students are going to be asked for these additional documents will be through email. And so this will vary, again, by institution by institution. A student might receive an email from the University of Virginia asking for X document, but then can receive an email from Yale for another document. So again, having your students to be proactive about checking their emails to make sure that they are putting themselves in a place to always be prepared for their best financial aid outcome is very, very important here as well. Lastly, one of our other big sources of financial aid will be state grants. These are individual states that will have tuition assistance programs and are usually typically grant funds. They depend on residency, so where a student lives, and will be dependent on what state aid they will be eligible to receive. To be eligible for your state's grants, they will most likely often have to require the FAFSA as well. For example, there's the New York State Tuition Assistance Program. So specifically for those of you who are working with New York students, this is eligible for New York students, for New York State residents who are attending eligible colleges within New York State. So this can be public or private. Their family has to have an income of that's less than $80,000, and these grants can range from something like $500 to $5,165 per year. Again, this differs state by state, and each state will have a different type of state grant-based grant program. As you can see with Ohio's College Opportunity Grant, this is only, again, eligible for Ohio residents attending eligible colleges within Ohio. Their income threshold is different, with it being $96,000, and their grants can range from $384 to $3,072 per year.
When thinking about how financial aid is determined, it's really important to take into consideration and just acknowledge all of the terminology that goes into calculating aid. The first being the cost of attendance. Cost of attendance varies by student because it not only takes into account the tuition, the fees, room and board, but it also takes into account different factors such as the transportation needs and personal expenses of an individual. From that, the estimated family contribution is taken away and the family contribution again is determined by the FAFSA. And from there, an institution determines the financial need of the student. And that's the amount that a college will seek to award through an aid package. When doing a lot of research, you may see different schools are capable of meeting different percentage of financial need. And it's important to understand that when a school says that they meet 100% of demonstrated need, that does not mean that a student is going to get a free ride to school, to a college. That just means that they're meeting the 100% of the financial need of that student as demonstrated when calculating the cost of attendance and the estimated family contribution.
So things to look out for here too is really when your high school students, your high school fellows expected family contribution looks higher than it might be. For those of you who are like working with students with lower incomes, you might, and if you see a really high EFC, that's not great and something you really want to review. So your high school fellow should really carefully review the student aid reports and make sure this FAFSA information is correct. And they should also discuss their options with the financial aid officer. If you know your student has a family income of around $30,000, but then you see an incredibly high expected family contribution, that's your tell to know that something went wrong in this process. And really understanding of what could be happening here is important, and so that you are working on the correct information. For others, you may find out that your high school fellow's expected family contribution is really high, and that's the accurate number. This doesn't mean that that the high school fellow will necessarily be expected to actually pay that amount. There will be means, either merit awards or outside awards, that could really help contribute to that EFC number, but this will also vary institution by institution. Some schools will do a really great job of making sure that they can meet the EFC, and then some others may not be able to we'll leave it so that the expected family contribution has to stay consistent across the board, no matter what type of financial aid your student receives. So again, if you feel that your student's EFC is really high and you would like to get a better picture of it or want to talk this out, flagging it for someone is important here too. Lastly, kind of also wanted to highlight some additional resources for you under the Matriculate curriculum. The studentaid.ed.gov for your hub for all federal and financial aid information, and some other couple of resources there for you as well. And also really there is a ton of information and a network of counselors and admissions counselors that have been really invested in this work and making sure they can make this archaic puzzle look a little bit easier than it has to be. So again, there's a ton out there, and if you still need assistance, make sure to flag that for someone as well. Lastly, as you kind of come out of this webinar, really, this is the checklist that you can use to go through with your high school fellow to kind of make sure that they are on the best positioned to really rocket this process. First and foremost, registering for that federal student aid ID, gathering the required financial documentation so that they can fill out all these documents, researching the financial aid deadlines for all schools on their college list, so schools like USC and Princeton, researching whether colleges on their list require the CSS and/or supplemental forms, investigating whether their state offers tuition assistance, taking the initiative to complete the FAFSA by the priority deadline, and then completing the CSS profile by the priority deadline as well. This will be your be-all, end-all list for the most of you to make sure that your students are on track. A little bit of a preview for next month. We will be doing a little bit of a deeper dive into financial aid in special circumstances and next steps if you do get hit with these circumstances. This is so especially for the CSS profile in case your student has a second parent or a non-custodial parent and what that process might look like to filling that out in CSS profile. Immigration status, how that might affect you with your students. What happens when your students get flagged with verification request. And then we will also have a financial aid officer on deck to help us out with the Q&A.
And in terms of next steps for you all, the milestone for high school fellows who submitted their college list has passed. But for those who have not yet submitted their college list, your campus leads will be reaching out to you to help support you in doing some more outreach with your high school fellow and ensuring that we receive all of the college lists. By September 17th, complete the September check-in. Make sure that your HSF is signed up for CBOS and save the date for October 12th. That is when the financial aid special circumstances webinar will be live. And finally, by November 15th, the milestone to complete and submit the FAFSA is due.
And that's it for us. Thank you guys so much for having us today. And again, let us know if you need any additional help or resources as you work with your high school fellows on the financial aid process. Until next time.